What is up, everybody, and welcome back to the Game Plan Educational Solutions. I'm Cecilia Tames, and in this channel, we talk about how history teachers can best level up their mindset, their management, and their methodology. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the lost art of direct instruction. Now, as an educational consultant in, over 100 teachers that I've coached, 7 school districts that I've worked with, and counting, the question that I most often get is, how does this look like when it comes to direct instruction? And the reason why I call this a lost art is because, let's get real, most of our professional development that we obtain is mostly directed at interventions, strategies, how to work in several situations, cooperative learning, hands-on, and those are all good and fine. But the truth is, social studies is a whole different ballgame, because sometimes in history, we just have to teach and front load some information. Now, the problem with not having a good strategy to either give direct instruction, or if you're a more experienced teacher, to audit your practices for direct instruction, is that if your students don't have a good solid foundation and didn't have a good understanding of the content that you front loaded to them from the start, well, guess what? No matter how wonderful and magical and awesome your cooperative learning and your body kinesthetic activities are, your students will not be able to participate or think at a higher level or answer higher order thinking questions if they don't have that foundation. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. Now, if you're excited to learn more about how you can improve and refine your practices for direct instruction, make sure you hit the like button, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and make sure you turn on that notification bell so you can know exactly when a new video drops. This also pushes us up further up in the algorithm, showing us to teachers that may actually need this. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, whether you teach on an online setting or in a face-to-face instructional setting, the first thing we always need to do and always need to know is, number one, where are students at? What background knowledge are they bringing to the table? What do they already know? And so the first thing you want to do when you're teaching direct instruction is assess your students. Now, this can involve asking them questions. This could involve maybe a digital quiz online. If you're teaching online, this could be a discussion. So any means that you can assess what background knowledge your students already have, what vocabulary words they're familiar with, what concepts do they already understand. This will immediately give you a good idea of what concepts or topics you're going to need to reiterate and what you're going to need to spend a little bit more time explaining. Because another question that sometimes pertains to this topic of direct instruction is, how much time am I supposed to spend on a certain content area? Well, this first element of direct instruction is actually going to help you determine that. And again, it just depends on the background knowledge that your students have. The second thing you want to do when teaching directly and front-loading information is you want to hook your students. Now, I know we're teachers, but I actually have dedicated countless hours to actually studying the psychology of how people's attention is sustained, what attracts humans to pay attention to something. And I do this a lot by studying, believe it or not, marketing and social media. In my program, Teach Like an Influencer, I actually use some of these tactics and strategies that companies have used, unfortunately, for maybe not so useful causes, such as getting people to scroll endlessly on social media. But I've used and I've studied those systems, those programs, those strategies that they use to sustain attention. And I'm thinking, we need to do this in an educational setting. So one of the things that I've learned in my extensive research is you need to hook your students with a story. Now, it'd be one thing to tell you, all right, folks, today we're going to talk about the American Revolution in 1776. You're going to lose the class. But if you start with something like, it was the night before Christmas Eve. The streets of Boston were ghastly and silent, and a thick, dense fog clouded the streets with a malevolent vibe. You know, if you really take a moment, you can find a story, you can find a video, anything that will help convey emotion to your class will get your students hooked. Research, marketing research, social media research shows us that if you can get a person to have an emotional response to something that you say, something that they see, something that they experience, then chances are they are going to, you're going to grab their attention. Now, in my research, I've also learned that learning actually happens when you, as the instructor, can forge a connection between a known and an unknown. So that means that when you hook your class and you hook the story, the analogy, the visual, the emotion should be such, it should be an emotion or a story or a visual that will tie to something that students do know at their age. Vocabulary words that they have heard before. This is why you pre-assess, right? So if we simply start talking about our content and we talk about, mercantilism, and we start talking about laissez-faire, and we start talking about all these concepts without associating them to something that is known, you're going to lose your class. This is where we lose the class because it does not compute, right? So when we talk about hooking your class, you need to make sure that that hook is going to connect your known and your unknown. The third element of good direct instruction is modeling, right? So, I've heard some teachers say, oh, well, we can't just give them the answers like, it's like pulling teeth or, we have to guide them so much. That's okay. That's what you're supposed to be doing. So if you feel like you have to provide a lot of guidance, a lot of prompting, that's okay. That's what you're there to do. You are teaching them how to think, with what mindset you need to approach a situation, right? So do not be discouraged by this. The next component of good direct instruction is tell a story. Now, in history specifically, it's really important, although not always feasible, but it's very important for us to stick to a chronological order, simply because I feel like in my experience, historical events are so vast and often overlap and they're so abstract. It's really important for us to create a sequence that our students can actually follow, because again, if you are jumping from one topic to another, guess what? It's not going to compute, right? You're connecting an unknown to another unknown, so they're not going to grasp it. So if you are using, Nearpod or a PowerPoint or a Google Slides or a video or whatever, make sure that it is sequential and that, again, it tells a story. If that visual, if that story can, again, evoke emotion from your student audience, even better, because when you have an emotional, psychology shows us when we have an emotional reaction to something, we remember it, right? So throughout your instruction, it's not simply enough to roll through a PowerPoint and have them write notes. You want to make sure that you're interjecting maybe some anecdotes or stories of individual characters in the lesson, again, to bring a more human appeal to your class, especially with history, where it's very challenging for students to see the relevancy. At least for the longest time, it was challenging for them to see the relevancy to their daily lives. So again, by bringing those human elements and making it a story, our instruction is story, we are helping the students find relevancy. Hey, that person had the same emotion I've experienced, right? Ooh, that must have sucked. So we are creating connection. Because of this, the King of England grew and grew more preoccupied, and his brows furrowed with fear that he would be ashamed before his French adversaries. So he says, I can't have this happen. He calls to him all his nobles and he says, men, it's no secret to you that we're getting our butt kicked really bad, right? He says, and well, gosh, I'll be darned, right, if the French beat us. The next element should be pretty self-explanatory, but as we provide that direct instruction, you want to always make sure you're pausing to assess. You got to make sure that those connections are being made. You have to make sure that your students are understanding this material so that you can feel confident that if you do ask them to think outside the box or you challenge them with a higher order question, they're going to be able to connect the dots for you, right? So you can assess, again, online, verbally, discussion, written assignments are a great way to get an understanding of what students are thinking. That could be typing a response. That could be something that challenges them to understand a point of view. So it could be a variety of formative assessments, but the important thing is to make sure that we're doing this throughout. Always pause to ask questions about the significance of the point of view, analyzing the causes, the effects, etc. Those are the things you want to focus on when it comes to historical teaching. The sixth tip that I have for you is have students teach the content back. So we know this, right? Any experienced teacher knows that if you can get your student to teach the content back or to teach it to somebody else, then they have full mastery because they understand it in a wider scope, in a bigger picture, right? So you can do several things. One of the things that I like to do every day when my class walks in is I will ask them and I'll hook them back with the story. Yesterday we left off just like it was a TV series, okay? So, and depending on your delivery and how much emphasis you put into that story and that emotional response, like you won't even have to segue into it. Your class will just ask you, Miss or Sir or whatever, right? Can we just jump right back into the story? Like what happens? So you can get the students to basically retell the story using their content vocabulary, and you may have to prompt them, but for the most part, in my over a decade teaching experience, I can tell you, when I do direct teaching in this way, I hardly have to prompt. If one student doesn't remember, another one will jump immediately in to finish the story and retell it back to the class. So it's very important that you're getting the students to give you back the information in their own words. And again, if they can tell you the information, if they can reteach the lesson or teach it to somebody else or do a buddy or a partner share out, or they can do a Kagan strategy or anything to illustrate or demonstrate that they know the content, you're on the right track. That means your direct teaching strategy did hook them, did engage them. They did find relevancy to it. There was an emotional response elicited from the way you delivered the content. You're on the right track. The final strategy for good direct instruction is at the end of your direct instruction time, you want to make sure you assess. And that is, again, just to consolidate what your students learned and that they understood all these basic concepts so that when you do step up into something more challenging, whether it be a discussion, a seminar, whether it be having to transfer that information because, those are part of our state standards. Can you transpose written information into a visual format or, create a project that shows whatever? If your class is able to do that, if you can assess them in this way, then again, your direct instruction was efficient. Now, in my program, Teach Like an Influencer, I do actually delve into a lot more detail about these strategies and the methodology for getting our students to engage so that they keep coming back and anticipating the lesson on their own. However, I hope that today's video was helpful and gives you a good starting point for your direct instruction. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on notifications. Make sure you stay tuned for next week's video, where I share a little bit more about the research that I've done as far as the psychology for engaging students, and where I show you different low-key ways that you can get your class hooked on your content, hooked on your lesson. If you're interested in learning more about my Teach Like an Influencer program, make sure to check out the link below. As always, I hope you have a fantastic day. Until next time, class dismissed.